joined today by Jean Pisani-Ferry, who's the director of the Bruegel Research Institute, a research think tank in Brussels that studies international economic issues. He's recently done a paper on the sovereign debt problems in Europe, and we're fortunate to have him here to discuss some background on those issues. Welcome, Jean.
Thank you.
My impression from what you've been writing is that there are big differences among the various countries and how they got to where they are and what might be proper policies to deal with the crisis that they're in. Maybe we can start with Greece, which has gotten a lot of the attention. How would you describe how Greece got into the problem they're in, and you've made some proposals about how to deal with Greece that are somewhat controversial.
Well, Greece is a German nightmare made reality. So a country that essentially mismanages its public finances, in addition that hides the true situation of its public finances. And then when it discovers, it blows up, and the question, nobody wants to finance the country, so it has to go to the IMF and go to the European Union. The European Union is not ready. It doesn't have any crisis management facility, and then for a long time, the Europeans agonize over the solution until finally they find an agreement to lend to Greece. The problem being for the Europeans that they had no agreement, no consensus on what to do in this kind of situation. For some, the rules of the game were you don't get any assistance. If you're not able to borrow, you just have to default. For others, there had to be an assistance on certain conditions. And the other question was who has to provide the assistance. Some said only the IMF, some said only the Europeans, and in the end it was jointly the Europeans and the IMF. So everything had to be invented on the spot.
But you've done in your research some calculations on the actual prospect for Greece servicing the debt, even with these new terms and new credit. Could you describe the basic conclusions that you reached and sort of the order of magnitude of the problem there?
Well, the question everybody has now is Greece going to be able to repay its debt, or is Greece in need for a restructuring, so an organized default? And the official line is that Greece has a program, an assistance program. It has to introduce harsh measures to cut the budget deficit, also reforms to improve supply side competitiveness, but that in the end, Greece will be able to come back to a more sustainable situation, by a combination of fiscal adjustment and privatization.
And how much fiscal adjustment do you estimate that they really are going to have to make if they're going to be able to pull out of this on their own?
Well, if you compute what kind of surplus, of primary surplus, so before interest on public debt, Greece has to reach in order first to stabilize the debt ratio, and then it's going to be stabilized at something like 150, 160% of GDP, bring it down to in the medium term to something that's clearly below 100%. Then depending on the assumption you make, you come to the conclusion that the primary surplus has to be way above 6% of GDP. Why I'm mentioning 6? It's because if you look in the past in the OECD countries, the advanced countries, what is the maximum primary surplus that was reached on a sustained basis by any country? It's 6%. So just because if you go beyond, essentially you ask your taxpayers to pay the interest on public debt, to pay taxes, to pay the interest on public debt, and the balance between that, what they're paying and what they're getting in terms of public services, becomes extremely imbalanced. So that's why some countries have reached higher numbers, but for a very limited period of time. Here we're speaking, if you want to bring the debt down just by this process of adjustment, it has to be sustained a very, very long period of time. And I don't think it is politically sustainable. Now, there's a question about the size of the possible privatization program. The Greek state owns a lot of assets, considerably more than in other countries. The problem being that large part of those assets just land. That is, in the hand of the states, but in fact, there are people using this land, having built their houses or exploiting this land as farmers. So it's extremely difficult to privatize. It's not something you can get rid of just by auctioning it out. So the potential for privatization is less than seems on paper, which makes me, pessimistic about the possibility for Greece to restore sustainability with the current level of debt without any kind of restructuring.
And so what kind of restructuring do you think might make sense in this situation?
Well, at some point, I think what makes sense is to offer to the bondholders some sort of conversion system by which they would either get a guarantee bond, but with a haircut, or something that would be indexed on the future GDP, so it would be more of the equity type, or perhaps also you can imagine a menu of options, as was done actually with the Latin American debt crisis in the past or other debt crises, where depending on the investors, they may have preferences for either taking their losses immediately or accepting the conversion into something that is more risky, that eventually may bring them back to better conditions, but also involves the risk of losing more.
Okay, let's turn to the case of Ireland. And they have also had serious debt problems. What was the source of their problems, and how serious do you think they are today?
Well, the problems of Ireland had almost nothing to do with the problems of Greece. I said Greece was a nightmare of the Germans, the Europeans made true, because they had this focus on the fiscal situation and the fact that your fiscal situation is safe, then you're safe. And Greece in this respect was not safe because the fiscal situation was so bad. The fiscal situation of Ireland was excellent, at least on paper. They had a budget in surplus, they had a 25% debt to GDP ratio, they had a booming economy, they were very competitive. It's a place where the US multinational invest to access the European market and to produce for the European market. So everything looked fine. The thing is that they let their financial system grow out of proportion with the size of the country. So taking on major implicit risk in the case the financial system would need to be bailed out. And they let a real estate bubble develop for a long time. Also because there was immigration. People came to Ireland. They were building houses. So there was an additional motive for developing the construction sector. The construction sector doubled or tripled as a proportion to GDP. The housing stock grew and grew. And finally, when the bubble burst, they found themselves, while with an extremely severe economic adjustment problem coming from this construction sector. People left the country, all the people from Eastern Europe left the country, and this kind of demand factor that came from the immigration shrank. And at the same time, the banks that had lent massively to finance this real estate bubble found themselves in a dire situation. So the government had to intervene time and again to rescue banks, and the total cost of rescuing the banking system is about 50% of GDP. So this is a country that went from a very sound fiscal situation to a very alarming fiscal situation all of a sudden, at a combination of two things. First, that the number of receipts depended on this domestic credit boom. So these receipts collapsed. And at the same time, all the costs of rescuing the banking sector came in. The speed at which the situation of Ireland was transformed from looking again very good, Ireland was dubbed the tiger of Europe, to a situation where this is the ability also for Ireland to repay the debt is being questioned. It's not the situation of Greece. The economic base is better. There's still a strong manufacturing sector which has not lost competitiveness, which is still able to export. There is, the economic fundamentals are better, but the cost of this macro mismanagement is huge.
And you say it's been 50% of GDP has gone into covering losses
yeah.
related to the banks. So is that complete? Will that continue to rise, or is that?
That the numbers that the Irish authorities gave very recently last week, in the first week of April, after having conducted stress tests with as many guarantees of quality and thoroughness they could have given. So I hope they are credible this time. Last time the stress tests were not credible. Last time the stress tests concluded that essentially the situation was safe, but part of the banking sector had not been submitted to stress tests, and the implementation of the stress test for those who had been submitted to the stress test was not thorough. So in fact, shortly afterward, it was discovered that the losses were much more.
And what do you think are the prospects that much more will need to be done to assist Ireland get through this crisis?
But Ireland has got international assistance, a program. There was a question about the interest rate, or there's still a question about the interest rate. The lending rate of the Europeans for Greece initially and also for Ireland was too high. There was this view that you need to set a high interest rate in order to avoid moral hazard. But moral hazard, for a country, for the citizens of a country, for a government, the worst is already the recession. You don't need, in addition, a punitive interest rate. A punitive interest rate can have the opposite effect, that it backfires. And at some point, people say, why should we be paying the other countries? Why are they making so much money on the loans given to us? But there is a fight going on between Ireland, the Irish government, and the rest of the EU, especially the French and the German, who insist that Ireland should increase its corporate tax rate because of what they perceive, what they say is unfair tax competition. And the Irish respond that for them, it is essential to have such a low tax rate, 25%, so that they can attract foreign direct investment, and that for them it's vital for the growth model for their recovery. So this fight is going on. The other Europeans have indicated willingness to lower the interest rate, but provided Ireland does something on the corporate tax rate.
Another issue that's raised in all of these European countries that have had sovereign debt problems is whether being part of the euro has affected them. Had they kept their own national currency, whether they would have had the crisis or whether they dealt with the crisis any differently. What is your feeling of your analysis on that?
Well, crises are not a phenomenon that's limited to the euro area, nor to countries with a fixed exchange rate regime. But what is clear is that there were a number of effects of joining the euro that for countries like Spain, like Portugal, like Greece, less for Ireland, it resulted in a drop in interest rate. The time they joined the euro, the interest rate, the long-term interest rate converged suddenly to the level of Germany, and so this drop in interest rate was a massive positive shock that set into motion this domestic credit boom. And after this boom was set into motion, it had an effect on prices, so price inflation started being higher. So with lower interest rate, higher inflation, you had very low real interest rates, and that fueled the boom for a long time. So the implication of being in the euro area is that you have to use other tools. You have to accept that if there is a credit boom, you have to tame the credit boom by using, for example, taxation of mortgages or regulatory instrument or prudential instruments. And there was a lot of resistance to that because it was believed that it's a market development, that the market development, who are you to know better what the right price of a house is? And the surveillance system, the coordination system in Europe was totally focused on the fiscal side, assuming that the public sector is in balance, everything is in balance. So private sector imbalances were not actually watched. They were not the matter for serious discussion and coordination. So all that contributed to letting these bubbles develop. Whereas the lesson is that in a monetary union, you have to take into account the fact that your interest rate, your monetary policy is not going to play the role it could play in a country with its own currency, and therefore you have to substitute through other means. And you have to accept also that the fiscal rectitude is not the only condition for stability.
Okay, very much. Thank you very much, Jean. We appreciate your coming in today. I'm sure our viewers will learn a lot from your background information. Thank you.